The year was 1886, and winter was slowly giving way to spring across the rugged plains of the Montana Territory. The snow had begun to melt from the hills, leaving behind muddy trails, rushing streams, and endless fields waiting to turn green again. Ranches were scattered miles apart, connected only by dusty wagon roads that stretched across the lonely frontier. Life in the American West demanded courage, patience, and endless hard work. Every sunrise meant another battle against harsh weather, broken fences, wandering cattle, and the uncertainty of tomorrow. Among the hard-working ranchers of the valley lived Samuel Carter, a respected cowboy in his late 30s whose strength was admired by everyone. Yet behind his calm expression was a heavy burden that no neighbor truly understood. 2 years earlier, Samuel's beloved wife, Mary, had died from a sudden illness, leaving him alone to raise their 5 young children while managing one of the largest cattle ranches in the county. From the moment the sun rose above the distant mountains until darkness settled over the prairie, Samuel worked without rest. Before dawn, he saddled his horse, checked the cattle grazing across the open range, repaired storm-damaged fences, and prepared supplies for the coming seasons. By the time he returned home each evening, his clothes were covered with dust. His boots were worn from countless miles, and his hands were rough from years of labor. But the hardest part of every day began after he stepped inside the ranch house. 5 children waited for him, each missing their mother in different ways. 12-year-old Jacob tried to act brave while secretly carrying responsibilities far beyond his age. 10-year-old Lucy quietly cared for her younger brothers and sister whenever she could. 8-year-old Ben had become stubborn and silent since losing his mother. 6-year-old Sarah often sat near the window hoping Mary would somehow return home, while little Tommy, only 4 years old, barely remembered his mother's face. Samuel loved them more than life itself, but no matter how hard he tried, he knew he could never replace the warmth, patience, and gentle love that only a mother could give. The ranch house itself reflected the family's sorrow. The once cheerful kitchen had become quiet, meals were simple and hurried, clothes waited days to be mended, and laughter had almost disappeared from the home. Samuel often found himself staring at Mary's empty rocking chair beside the fireplace after the children had gone to bed. Many nights he wondered whether he was failing as both a father and a rancher. Friends from neighboring ranches offered advice, encouraging him to remarry, but Samuel wasn't looking for another wife. His heart still belonged to Mary, and he believed no one could ever take her place. What he truly needed was someone trustworthy who could help care for the children and restore order to the household while he worked to keep the ranch alive. After many sleepless nights, Samuel finally rode into the small frontier town of Red Creek. He stopped at the general store where travelers, ranchers, and settlers often gathered. Taking a pencil from his pocket, he carefully wrote a simple notice and pinned it to the wooden bulletin board. It read, "Housekeeper wanted, honest work, fair pay, room and board provided." He looked at the sign for a long moment before quietly riding back toward the ranch, uncertain whether anyone would answer such a lonely request. 3 days later, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, Samuel was repairing a broken wagon wheel outside the barn when he noticed someone walking slowly up the dusty road. It was a young woman carrying a small carpet bag, her clothes showing signs of long travel. She wore a faded brown prairie dress, a simple cream bonnet tied beneath her chin, a weathered wool shawl draped over her shoulders, and worn leather boots covered in trail dust. Though tired, she carried herself with quiet dignity. When she reached the ranch gate, she paused for a moment, gathering the courage to speak. Samuel walked toward her, wondering if she had lost her way. The young woman offered a polite smile and lowered her eyes. In a soft, uncertain voice, she said, "My name is Emma Collins. I saw your notice in town." She tightened her grip on the old carpet bag before adding almost in a whisper, I just need a housekeeping job." Samuel looked past her toward the empty road stretching across the prairie, completely unaware that the woman standing before him had not only come to help his household, but would soon change the lives of every member of his family forever. Samuel stood quietly for a moment before opening the ranch gate. Something in Emma Collins's gentle voice and humble appearance reminded him of the kindness his late wife had always shown to strangers. He welcomed her inside and showed her the modest ranch house where his 5 children waited nervously in the sitting room. Jacob, the oldest, crossed his arms and watched silently, determined not to trust another stranger. Lucy politely greeted Emma, but stayed close to her younger sister Sarah. Ben hid behind the doorway while little Tommy clung tightly to Samuel's leg. Emma smiled warmly at each child without forcing a conversation. Instead of trying to impress them, she simply introduced herself and quietly unpacked the few belongings she owned. Before sunset, she had already swept the floors, prepared a hot stew, baked fresh bread, and repaired a torn blanket that had been lying untouched for weeks. That evening, for the first time since Mary's passing, the Carter family sat together around the dinner table sharing a warm meal in peaceful silence. As the weeks passed, Emma became an important part of daily life on the ranch. Every morning she rose before sunrise, lit the stove, packed Samuel's lunch, and prepared breakfast for the children before sending them outside to help with simple chores. She taught Lucy and Sarah how to bake bread, encouraged Jacob to keep studying instead of carrying every burden alone, patiently helped Ben overcome his sadness, and filled Tommy's days with laughter through simple games and bedtime stories. She never tried to replace their mother or ask them to forget the woman they had loved. Instead, she honored Mary's memory by caring for the children with the same kindness and patience that had once filled the ranch house. Slowly, the empty home began to feel alive again. The sound of children's laughter returned to the yard, songs echoed from the kitchen while Emma worked, and neighbors noticed that the Carter ranch no longer seemed lonely. One bitter winter evening, a powerful snowstorm swept across the Montana plains. Samuel and several neighboring cowboys spent hours rescuing frightened cattle trapped in deep snowdrifts. Exhausted and freezing, he finally returned home long after dark. As he quietly opened the front door, the warm glow of the fireplace greeted him. Inside, Emma sat in the old rocking chair reading a story while all 5 children rested peacefully around her. Tommy had fallen asleep with his head resting against her shoulder. Sarah held Emma's hand, and even Jacob, who had once refused to trust anyone, listened with a peaceful smile. Samuel stood silently in the doorway, realizing that the empty house he had struggled to protect had finally become a true home once again. The loneliness that had haunted every room since Mary's death had quietly disappeared. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Samuel and Emma sat together on the porch beneath a sky filled with bright winter stars. The cold air carried the distant sound of horses in the barn while snow covered the quiet valley. Samuel looked toward the mountains before speaking honestly. "The day you arrived," he said softly, "I believed I was hiring someone to clean my house and cook meals. But you gave my children something I couldn't give them alone. You gave them hope." Emma smiled gently, her eyes glistening with emotion. "When I answered your notice," she replied, "I thought I only needed a job and a place to stay. I never imagined I would find a family." They sat together in comfortable silence, knowing that neither of them had expected life to lead them to this moment. When spring finally returned to the Montana Territory, bringing green grass and blooming wildflowers across the prairie, Samuel invited friends and neighbors to a small gathering beneath the great cottonwood tree overlooking the ranch. With his 5 children standing proudly beside him, he took Emma's hands and asked if she would remain with them, not as a housekeeper, but as his wife and the loving mother his children had already chosen in their hearts. Tears filled Emma's eyes as she quietly. As the warm spring sun settled over the American frontier, the Carter Ranch became known not for its hardships, but for the family that had been rebuilt through kindness, faith, and second chances. What began with a simple request for a housekeeper ended with a home overflowing with love, proving that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive when people least expect them.